In a limestone cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, a man was buried more than 70,000 years ago, with flowers pressed into the soil beside him. That, at least, is one interpretation of what the excavators found in the 1950s. What is not disputed is that this man, known to science as Shanidar IV, was old for his time, badly injured long before he died, and could not have survived his final years without the sustained help of other people. His right arm had been amputated or lost above the elbow. His skull carried the marks of a healed blow. His teeth were worn down almost to the roots. His spine curved from arthritis, so severe that every step would have hurt him. And still, he lived. Someone brought him food. Someone brought him water. Someone kept him warm through the freezing mountain winters. Someone, in short, cared for him when he could no longer care for himself. Whoever those people were, they were not the same species as the ones we usually credit with inventing medicine. Shanidar IV was a Neanderthal, and the hands that fed him were Neanderthal hands. For most of the last century, we told ourselves a simpler story. Healing, we said, began with civilization. Medicine, we said, began with writing. The first doctors, we imagined, were priests in Egyptian temples or Greek scholars mixing herbs in polished bowls under painted ceilings. Anything before that was superstition, guesswork, or luck. If prehistoric people survived injury, they survived by accident. If they lived past 40, they lived because their bones were stubborn. If they used plants, they used them without knowing why. That was the story. It was tidy, it was flattering to us, and it was almost entirely wrong. Over the last 20 years, a quiet revolution has moved through the study of human origins. It did not arrive with a single discovery. It arrived through a slow accumulation of molecular evidence pulled from ancient bones, ancient teeth, ancient soil, and, most recently, ancient dental plaque. The technique is called ancient DNA analysis, and it has done something no shovel could ever do. It has looked inside the mouths and the guts and the bloodstreams of people who died tens of thousands of years ago, and it has read what was there. It has read the bacteria they carried. It has read the plants they chewed. It has read the medicines they swallowed. It has read the diseases they fought, and it has read the genes that shaped how their bodies responded to those diseases, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. What ancient DNA is telling us now is not a small correction to the old story. It is a different story entirely. It is the story of healers who lived before farming, before pottery, before writing, before cities, before any of the markers we usually associate with civilization. It is the story of people who knew which plant reduced a fever, which fungus fought infection, which root stopped bleeding, and which bark eased pain. It is the story of grandmothers who lived long enough to teach, of elders who lived long enough to remember, of communities that carried the injured and fed the sick and buried the dead with care. And it is a story written not in stone tools or cave paintings, though those matter, but in the invisible chemistry of teeth and bone, patient and quiet, waiting for us to develop the tools to read it. Consider the mouth of a Neanderthal woman who died in a cave in northern Spain about 50,000 years ago. Her skeleton was crushed beneath a rockfall, and her teeth were preserved almost perfectly, sealed inside the fallen limestone, like a message in a stone envelope. When researchers scraped the hardened dental plaque from those teeth and sequenced the DNA trapped inside, they found something unexpected. They found poplar. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid, the same compound found in modern aspirin. They found penicillium mold. Penicillium is the source of the first antibiotics developed in the 20th century. She had not eaten these things by accident. Her teeth showed signs of a painful dental abscess, a gum infection so severe it would have thrown a modern person into fever and delirium. She was chewing poplar for the pain. She was chewing mold for the infection. She was medicating herself more than 40,000 years before the first pyramid was built, and more than 50,000 years before Alexander Fleming rediscovered penicillin in a London laboratory. That single mouth changed how researchers talk about prehistoric medicine. But it was not alone. Across Europe, across the Middle East, across Africa, across Asia, ancient DNA has begun to reveal a hidden layer of human history that we could never see with our eyes alone. It has revealed that Neanderthals treated wounds. It has revealed that early modern humans carried genetic adaptations to specific diseases. It has revealed that certain communities lived with tuberculosis, with plague, with hepatitis, with leprosy, thousands of years before those diseases were named or described. And it has revealed that within those communities, some individuals lived far longer than they should have, given their injuries. Somebody was helping them. Somebody was making the difference between a body that healed and a body that did not. Who were those people? What did they know? How did they learn it? How did they pass it on to the next generation without books, without schools, without any of the institutions we now consider essential to preserving knowledge? And what does it mean for us, sitting in a world of hospitals and vaccines and antibiotics, to discover that our deep ancestors were doing versions of the same work in caves lit by firelight, in shelters built against glacial winds, in valleys where saber-toothed cats still hunted and mammoths still walked? Those are the questions this documentary will follow. The evidence is scattered across dozens of countries and dozens of laboratories, but it is beginning to speak with one voice. The first healers did not appear with civilization. They appeared long before it. They were already here when we came out of Africa. They were already here when the first paintings went onto cave walls. They may have been here longer than our own species has existed, and if ancient DNA is right, they left traces of their work inside every one of us, coded into the very immune systems that keep us alive today. We begin in a cave. We begin with a broken body that should have died young, and did not. We begin with the invisible fingerprint of care, pressed into the shape of a healed bone, and with the microscopic residues clinging to the surfaces of teeth that stopped chewing when the last ice age was still deep and the world was still cold. The first healers are quiet in the archaeological record, but they are not silent. Ancient DNA has learned how to hear them. What follows is what it has heard so far, and what it may still tell us in the years to come. Chapter 1. The Bones That Should Not Have Healed. To understand what ancient DNA reveals about the first healers, we have to begin with something older than DNA analysis itself. We have to begin with the bones. Long before geneticists learned to extract sequences from ancient teeth, physical anthropologists were looking at Neanderthal and early modern human skeletons and noticing something strange. They were noticing wounds that had closed. They were noticing fractures that had fused. They were noticing infections that had scarred over instead of killing the person who carried them. And each of those healed injuries was a small mystery, because in the wild, healing takes time. Time requires safety. Safety requires other people. And other people, in the deep past, are exactly what the traditional story of prehistoric survival did not want to give us. Consider what a broken leg meant in the Pleistocene. In a world without splints, without crutches, without hospitals, a broken femur was almost always a death sentence. Not because the bone could not heal on its own. The bone often could, given enough time. The problem was the weeks required for that healing. A person with a broken leg cannot run from a predator, cannot fetch water, cannot hunt or gather, cannot move with the group when the group moves to follow the herds or escape a coming storm. In every other large mammal we study, a broken leg means starvation, dehydration, or predation, usually within days. Yet the archaeological record is full of humans and Neanderthals who broke bones and lived long enough for those bones to knit back together. In the language of the excavator, the fracture is remodeled. In the language of daily life, someone stayed, someone brought water, someone drove off the wolves, someone chose the harder road of care over the easier road of abandonment. The Shanidar cave in northern Iraq is the most famous example, but it is not the only one. When Ralph Selecki excavated Shanidar in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, buried at different times over a span that may cover more than 50,000 years. Several of them showed severe injuries that had healed. Shanidar I, sometimes called the Old Man of Shanidar, had lost the use of his right arm long before he died. The bone above his elbow was withered, suggesting an old amputation or a paralysis. His right eye socket showed damage that would likely have blinded him on that side. His right foot had healed fractures. His skull carried a healed, crushing blow above the left eye. He was, by any measure, a catalogue of near-death experiences, and yet he lived into what for a Neanderthal was old age, perhaps his 40s, perhaps even a little older. He did not do that alone. He could not have. The pattern repeats across the Neanderthal world. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a Neanderthal man in his late 30s or 40s suffered from severe arthritis, tooth loss, and healed injuries. His jaw was so worn that he could not have chewed tough food effectively. Someone was preparing his meals. Someone was softening the meat, perhaps by pounding it or cooking it long, perhaps by chewing it first and passing it back. At Krapina in Croatia, dozens of Neanderthal individuals show healed injuries. At Cima de las Palomas in Spain, at Kebara in Israel, at Amud in Israel, at Feldhofer in Germany, the same story emerges. Neanderthals broke, and Neanderthals healed, and Neanderthals lived on. The consistency across sites is striking. It is not one lucky individual. It is not two. It is a repeated pattern, spread across a continent and 100,000 years. Now, some anthropologists have pushed back against the softer interpretation of these bones. They have pointed out that healed injuries prove someone survived. They do not automatically prove someone was cared for. A person with a limp can still gather berries. A person with one arm can still sit near a fire. Perhaps, they argue, Neanderthals were simply tougher than we think. Perhaps their communities tolerated the injured without actively nursing them. That is a fair caution, and any honest documentary must acknowledge it. But there are cases where the injury is so severe and the recovery so long that passive tolerance cannot explain the outcome. Consider a case from La Pharmacie in southwestern France. The individual known as La Pharmacie I was an adult male Neanderthal with severe dental disease, healed rib fractures, degenerative joint disease, and evidence of a long-term illness that left marks on his bones. He died and was buried in what appears to be a deliberate grave, but before he died he lived for months, possibly years, with conditions that would have made independent survival extremely difficult in a harsh Pleistocene landscape. Someone brought him what he needed. Someone kept him alive when nature would have taken him quickly. The pattern is not limited to Neanderthals. Early modern humans show the same signs. The Sungir burials in Russia, dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, include an adolescent boy whose thigh bone was so bowed and shortened by a congenital condition that he could barely have walked. Yet he lived to about 12 or 13 years of age, and he was buried with extraordinary care, wrapped in thousands of ivory beads that would have taken thousands of hours to produce. He did not survive because he was strong. He survived because his community valued him enough to feed him, protect him, and, at his death, to honor him in a way that would have required the labor of many people over many days. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, a woman who lived roughly 26,000 years ago showed evidence of a facial deformity, possibly from an old injury or from a developmental condition. She too was buried with care, her face covered by a mammoth shoulder blade, her body placed in a triple grave with two young men. She had lived into adulthood in a landscape of mammoths and wolves and glacial winters, in a place where every day required calories and coordination. That is not luck. That is community. That is a group of people who decided, in some way we cannot fully reconstruct, that she belonged with them. The bones, then, tell us the first part of the story. They tell us that from at least the Middle Paleolithic onward, humans and their close relatives kept the injured alive. They did not always succeed. Many bones show injuries that killed, and many burials contain the remains of people who died young from wounds or infections that no amount of care could reverse. But often enough to matter, they show injuries that did not kill. That gap between the injury and the death is the space where the first healers worked. It is a space we cannot see directly, but we can measure it. And what we measure is that the space is wide, and it is old. And it is filled with the shadows of people whose faces we will never see, but whose actions still leave traces in the fossilized record of their patience. Now, how did they do it? How did a Neanderthal woman keep an injured brother alive through a winter in the Zagros? How did a mammoth hunter feed a child who could not walk? What did they know about wounds? What did they know about fever? What did they know about the plants growing around them, and about the animals whose fat and skin and sinew could be used for warmth and healing? For most of the 20th century, we had no way to answer those questions. The bones healed, but the medicine did not fossilize, or so we thought, until, quite recently, we discovered that some of it did. This is where ancient DNA enters the story, because it turns out that when a person chews a plant, some of that plant leaves a molecular fingerprint on the surface of their teeth. When bacteria grow in a wound, some of those bacteria leave DNA traces in the surrounding bone. When a person swallows a fungus or a resin or a bark, tiny fragments of that substance can become trapped in the mineralized layer that forms on teeth over years of eating. That mineralized layer is called dental calculus, or tartar, and it turns out to be one of the most extraordinary time capsules ever discovered. It preserves DNA. It preserves proteins. It preserves plant particles. It preserves fungal spores. It preserves, in some cases, the exact chemical signatures of medicinal compounds swallowed in a specific week of a specific life, tens of thousands of years ago. For a long time, dental calculus was considered a nuisance. Excavators cleaned it off. Museums scraped it away. It was seen as dirty, unimportant, an obstacle to studying the teeth themselves. Then, in the last 15 years or so, a small group of researchers began asking what was inside it. They began treating dental calculus not as debris, but as archive. And when they cracked it open, they found things nobody expected. They found the invisible chemistry of prehistoric medicine. They found the mouths of the first healers, and they found, quite unexpectedly, that those mouths still had something to say. Chapter 2. The Woman Whose Mouth Told the Truth. She lived in a limestone cave in the mountains of northern Spain, in a place we now call El Cidrón. She was young, probably in her 20s, and she was in pain. Ancient DNA cannot tell us her name, but it can tell us, in remarkable detail, what was happening inside her mouth in the days and weeks before she died. And what was happening inside her mouth changes the history of medicine. It changes what we thought we knew about who was capable of care, and when, and where, and why. The El Sidron cave was discovered by chance in 1994, when two speleologists exploring the region stumbled upon a passage that opened into a hidden chamber. Inside the chamber were bones, human bones. When paleoanthropologists began systematic excavation, they realized that these bones were not modern. They were Neanderthal, and they were old, dating to roughly 49,000 years ago, which places them squarely in the late Middle Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years before the arrival of modern humans in that part of Iberia. The cave had been sealed for millennia, protecting its contents from the weathering that destroys most ancient organic material. The El Sidron remains represent at least 13 individuals, including men, women, and children. They appear to have died together, possibly during a period of extreme hardship, and their bones show signs that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of cannibalism, though this interpretation remains debated. Whatever the cause of their deaths, the conditions of their burial were unusually good for preserving DNA. The cave was cold, dark, and stable. Water had sealed the chamber. The bones were protected from sunlight, from oxygen, from the microbial activity that usually destroys ancient genetic material within a few thousand years. In effect, the cave became a natural refrigerator, and inside that refrigerator, the molecular record of a small Neanderthal community was quietly preserved. When a team led by researchers at institutions including the University of Adelaide, the University of Liverpool, and the Max Planck Institute began to examine the teeth of one particular individual from El Sidron, they used a relatively new technique. They scraped the hardened plaque, the dental calculus, from her teeth. They ground it into powder. They extracted the DNA trapped inside, and they sequenced it. What came back was a molecular portrait of a mouth that had been silent for nearly 50,000 years. What they found was extraordinary. The DNA in her calculus contained not only the expected bacterial signatures of a Paleolithic mouth, but also plant DNA that did not belong to any of the foods she was likely to have eaten. Specifically, they found DNA from poplar, a tree whose bark and leaves contain salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the active compound in willow bark, and it is the direct chemical ancestor of aspirin. It reduces fever, it reduces inflammation, it reduces pain. In a person suffering from a toothache, poplar would have been one of the most useful plants in the forest, and it would have grown, in her landscape, along the banks of the streams she must have known well. And she was suffering from a toothache. When researchers examined her jaw, they found clear evidence of a dental abscess, a deep pocket of infection at the root of one of her teeth. Anyone who has had a dental abscess knows what this means. It means throbbing, radiating pain. It means fever. It means difficulty eating, difficulty sleeping, difficulty focusing on even the simplest tasks. Untreated, a dental abscess in the Paleolithic could kill. The infection could spread into the jaw, into the sinuses, into the bloodstream. It could cause sepsis. It could cause meningitis. It could take a healthy young woman and end her life within weeks, in a rising fever that no amount of care could break. She was chewing poplar. And that was not all. The DNA in her calculus also contained sequences matching Penicillium, a genus of mold that includes the species from which the first antibiotic was derived. Now, we must be careful here. The presence of Penicillium DNA in dental calculus does not prove that she was deliberately consuming an antibiotic. Penicillium is a common environmental mold, and it can appear on many foods, especially if those foods have been stored for any length of time. But combined with the poplar and combined with the abscess, the pattern is suggestive. This was a woman with a specific problem who appears to have been consuming specific substances that would have addressed that problem. The El Sidron discovery, published in the journal Naturwissenschaften in 2012 and further developed in Nature in 2017, was one of the first pieces of direct molecular evidence that Neanderthals used plants medicinally. Before these studies, we had circumstantial evidence. We had healed injuries. We had burials with what looked like grave offerings. We had ethnographic parallels from modern hunter-gatherer societies, who universally use plant medicines. But we did not have physical proof that a specific individual, at a specific moment in deep prehistory, had put a specific medicinal substance in their mouth for a specific medical reason. Now we did, and the implications were significant, because if a young Neanderthal woman knew to chew poplar bark for a toothache, she did not learn that alone. She learned it from someone. Someone taught her which tree to strip. Someone showed her how much to chew, how long to keep it in her mouth, when to spit and when to swallow. That someone was a healer, or was passing on knowledge from a healer. The chain of transmission stretches backward into the mist of Middle Paleolithic time, and it stretches sideways, connecting one Neanderthal community to another across the mountains and rivers of Ice Age Europe. It stretches, in ways we cannot fully trace, into a shared body of knowledge that no one wrote down and no one had to. The El Sidron woman was not the only Neanderthal whose calculus told a story. Similar studies at other sites have revealed similar patterns. At Spy Cave in Belgium, another Neanderthal individual showed dental calculus rich in plant residues, including grasses, roots, and other materials. The Spy Neanderthal had a diet dominated by animal protein, but the plant content in the calculus indicated that plants were also part of daily life, either as food, as medicine, or both. At Kibara in Israel, a Neanderthal burial produced calculus with pollen and plant fragments that reflected the surrounding environment. Neanderthals were not simply eating meat, as older reconstructions suggested. They were engaging with the botanical world in ways that were varied and specific. But the El Sidron woman remains the clearest single case, because her calculus contained specific compounds that matched a specific medical need. Her mouth was, in effect, a small clinical record. It documented an illness. It documented a treatment. And it documented the outcome, which in her case was death, though we cannot know whether her medications helped her, hurt her, or simply eased her final days as her body lost the battle against the infection in her jaw. There is something almost unbearably intimate about this evidence. We are, quite literally, looking inside her mouth. We are reading her attempt to survive. And what we read is competence. Not desperation, not accident, competence. She knew what to do. She did it. She was not the only one, either at El Sidron or in the wider Neanderthal world. She is simply the one whose evidence was preserved well enough for us to see. Behind her stand many others, invisible to us, but present in the shared knowledge she carried in her aching jaw, in the reflex that told her to reach for the bark rather than the stone. There is also something humbling about it. For decades we told ourselves that Neanderthals were dim, brutish, incapable of complex culture. We built that picture from partial skeletons and from the biases of 19th century anatomists who could not imagine that any human relative could be as thoughtful as themselves. Ancient DNA has, one discovery at a time, dismantled that picture. Neanderthals buried their dead. Neanderthals used pigment. Neanderthals made string. Neanderthals hunted large game with sophisticated cooperation. And Neanderthals, we now know, used medicine. They were, in every meaningful sense, healers. They may not have written down what they knew, but they carried it in their heads and passed it into the mouths of the next generation, one aching tooth at a time, one fevered child at a time, one wound at a time. Chapter 3. The Chemistry, Hidden in Ancient Teeth. To understand how we know what we know about the first healers, we have to spend some time inside a laboratory. Not a Paleolithic laboratory, though those may have existed in the form of hearths and grinding stones and drying racks arranged around cave entrances. A modern one, with clean rooms, with white coats, with sequencing machines that can read the genetic code of a single microbe from a single fragment of ancient plaque. The story of the first healers is inseparable from the story of the technology that recovered them. Without ancient DNA analysis, we would still be arguing about whether Neanderthals ate plants at all. With it, we can ask what plants, in what quantities, for what purposes, and in what combinations. The technology matters, so let us spend a chapter learning what it can and cannot do. Ancient DNA, often shortened to aDNA, is genetic material that has survived in biological tissues after the death of the organism. Under normal conditions, DNA degrades quickly. Enzymes attack it, water breaks it apart, ultraviolet light shatters its chemical bonds, bacteria feed on it. Within days of death in a warm, wet environment, DNA in a body is essentially gone, dissolved into the soil like sugar into water. But under certain conditions, and especially in cold, dry, dark, or otherwise stable environments, small fragments of DNA can persist for tens of thousands of years, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Those fragments are broken. They are chemically damaged. They are contaminated by the DNA of every microbe and every human who has ever touched the sample. But they are there, and with the right techniques, they can be read. The turning point in ancient DNA research came in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when a technology called next-generation sequencing began to mature. Before that, extracting DNA from ancient samples was possible, but painfully limited. Researchers could target specific short sequences, usually mitochondrial DNA, which is present in thousands of copies per cell and therefore more likely to survive. They could get glimpses, but they could not read a whole genome. With next-generation sequencing, everything changed. Suddenly, scientists could sequence billions of short DNA fragments in parallel. They could reconstruct entire ancient genomes from a few grams of powdered bone. They could compare those genomes to modern populations and trace migration, admixture, and adaptation across thousands of years. The first ancient human genome to be sequenced was that of a hair sample from a 4,000-year-old Paleo-Eskimo man in Greenland, published in 2010. The first Neanderthal genome followed the same year. The first Denisovan genome, from a tiny finger bone in a Siberian cave, came shortly after. Each new sequence rewrote a chapter of human evolution, and as the technology improved, its scope expanded. Researchers began to look not just at the human DNA in ancient samples, but at everything else. At the DNA of the microbes that lived on and in the person. At the DNA of the plants and animals they ate. At the DNA of the diseases they carried, and at the DNA of the medicines, if we can call them that, they consumed. The ancient sample was no longer just a body. It was an ecosystem, and it was ready to be read. Dental calculus turned out to be the richest ecosystem of all. Calculus forms when saliva minerals combine with the biofilm of bacteria that grows on teeth. Over months and years, this biofilm hardens into a stone-like layer. In modern humans, dentists routinely scrape it off. In prehistoric humans, it accumulated. And every microbe that lived in the mouth, every plant particle that was chewed, every food fiber, every fungal spore, every medicinal residue could become trapped in the hardening matrix. Once it was trapped, it was protected. The mineral shell shielded it from bacterial decay. It shielded it from water. It shielded it from most forms of chemical degradation. For tens of thousands of years, an ancient mouth could hold on to what had passed through it, like a small museum sealed inside the enamel. When researchers first began systematically studying dental calculus in the early 2010s, the results were startling. A single milligram of Neanderthal calculus could yield hundreds of thousands of DNA reads. Many of those reads matched oral bacteria, some of which are still present in human mouths today, and some of which have gone extinct in our lineage but persist elsewhere. Others matched plants, ranging from grasses to conifers to flowering herbs. Still others matched fungi, and a small but significant fraction matched compounds associated with medicinal use. One of the most important findings from calculus research is that the oral microbiome, the community of bacteria living in the mouth, has changed dramatically over human history. Neanderthal oral microbiomes were different from modern human ones. Paleolithic modern humans had oral microbiomes different from Neolithic farmers, and Neolithic farmers had oral microbiomes different from modern city dwellers. The transition to agriculture, in particular, seems to have brought dramatic shifts in oral bacteria, with species associated with carbohydrate-rich diets becoming much more common. Diseases such as cavities and gum disease, rare or absent in most Paleolithic populations, became widespread with the adoption of cereals. Our mouths, quite literally, tell the story of how we started eating, and of what that eating cost us. But oral microbiomes tell another story too. They tell the story of health and disease. Certain bacteria are associated with dental abscesses, others are associated with periodontitis. Still others are associated with systemic infections that begin in the mouth and travel elsewhere in the body. When researchers find those bacteria in ancient calculus, they can begin to reconstruct what illnesses an individual was suffering from, sometimes with remarkable precision. And when they find plant DNA in the same calculus, they can ask whether the plant matches what a healer might have prescribed for that illness. The mouth becomes a case file, opened many thousands of years after the patient has been forgotten by everyone but the earth that held her. This is where the science of ancient DNA meets the archaeology of medicine. We can now, in some cases, identify a Paleolithic individual who had a specific disease and consumed a specific plant known to treat that disease. That is not proof of medical intent, but it is powerful evidence, and it accumulates. Across dozens of sites, across thousands of years, patterns emerge. Neanderthals with joint problems chewed plants containing anti-inflammatory compounds. Early modern humans with parasites chewed plants known in ethnobotany to expel worms. Neolithic farmers with respiratory infections consumed plants used for coughs and congestion. The correspondence is not perfect, and the interpretation must be cautious. But it is there, and it is remarkable, and it grows stronger with every new sample sequenced. There are limits to what ancient DNA can tell us. It cannot tell us whether the person understood the plant as medicine or simply as food. It cannot tell us who prepared the preparation. It cannot tell us what words were spoken. It cannot tell us whether a healer stood over the patient with quiet instructions, or whether the sick person simply crawled to the nearest useful tree. These are questions that DNA cannot answer. They must be approached through analogy, through ethnography, through the study of living hunter-gatherer societies whose traditions may echo, however faintly, the traditions of our deep past. But ancient DNA can tell us something the other sources cannot. It can tell us that the plant was used. Not that it might have been used, not that it could have been used, that it was used in this mouth, at this time, in this place, by this individual. That certainty is a gift. It anchors the story of prehistoric medicine in physical reality. It converts speculation into evidence. And it makes it possible to write about the first healers not as a romantic idea, but as a documented reality, with names attached to sites, and dates attached to samples, and molecules attached to mouths. In the chapters that follow, we will draw on that evidence extensively. We will visit specific sites where specific individuals left specific traces of specific treatments. We will meet, as closely as science allows, the Neanderthals and modern humans and archaic populations whose mouths and bones have testified to their attempts to heal one another. And we will begin to reconstruct, cautiously, the shape of a knowledge system that predates writing by tens of thousands of years. The technology that makes this possible is barely 2 decades old. What it has already revealed is enough to rewrite textbooks. What it may yet reveal, in the next 20 years, is anyone's guess. But the direction is clear. The first healers were not inventions of our imagination. They lived, and their teeth are talking. Chapter 4: The Grandmother Effect and the Long Memory of Care. Somewhere in prehistoric Africa, perhaps 200,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, something began to happen inside human populations that had never happened before in the history of large mammals. Women started living past their reproductive years. In most mammal species, females die shortly after they can no longer reproduce. In humans, they do not. Human women, on average, live decades past menopause. And those decades appear to have been, and to remain, biologically valuable. They are the decades of the grandmother. And the grandmother, according to a growing body of evidence, is one of the earliest and most important sources of medical knowledge in our species. The grandmother hypothesis, developed most fully by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues starting in the 1980s, proposes that the unusual human life history, with its long post-reproductive phase, exists because grandmothers contribute to the survival of their grandchildren. Grandmothers gather food. Grandmothers care for the young. Grandmothers pass on information about where the water is, which berries are safe, which paths are dangerous, which plants heal. In doing so, they free up their daughters to have more children, and they increase the survival of the children who are born. Over evolutionary time, this creates selection pressure for longevity. Genes that let women live longer are passed down through the greater success of their grandchildren, and the population as a whole develops the long-lived life history we now take for granted. Ancient DNA has, in recent years, added a new layer to this hypothesis. It has begun to reveal that in some Paleolithic populations the proportion of older adults, particularly older women, was higher than we might have expected. At the Krapina rock shelter in Croatia, for example, the Neanderthal remains include several individuals who lived into what for the time was old age. At Sunghir in Russia, the modern human burials include not only children but also older adults who bear the marks of long lives. At Dolny Vesternice, the same. Old people were part of the population, and they were part of it in numbers that suggest they were valued and supported by the group, not treated as burdens to be shed when times grew hard. The connection between grandmothers and healing is not merely speculative. It is grounded in observations of living hunter-gatherer societies, and it is supported by cross-cultural patterns. In nearly every foraging society that anthropologists have studied, older women are the primary knowledge holders regarding plants. They know which roots to dig, which leaves to boil, which barks to strip. They know the names of hundreds of species. They know the seasons in which each plant is potent and the seasons in which it is empty. They know how to prepare each preparation, how to store it, how to give it, and how much to give. They learned this knowledge from older women before them, over years of watching, listening, and practicing, and when they are old enough themselves, they teach it to their daughters and their daughters' daughters, closing a loop that has probably been closing for as long as our species has existed. This is not proof that Paleolithic grandmothers were healers. Ethnographic analogy must always be used with care. Not every modern hunter-gatherer society is a preserved fragment of the Paleolithic, and different societies organize knowledge differently. But it is a strong hint. And when we combine that hint with the archaeological evidence of long-lived older women, and with the botanical evidence from dental calculus, and with the survival of injured individuals who could not have healed without help, a picture begins to emerge. It is a picture of prehistoric societies in which knowledge accumulated across generations, in which older members played essential roles, and in which the care of the sick and injured was distributed across a network of people, many of them women, many of them old. Consider what it takes to know a landscape medicinally. A single valley in temperate Europe might contain hundreds of plant species. Some are food, some are poison, some are food in one season and poison in another. Some are medicine at low doses and poison at high doses. Some interact with other plants in dangerous ways. To learn all of that by trial and error in a single lifetime is essentially impossible. Trial and error kills. But if the knowledge is passed on, if each generation adds a little to what came before, if the mistakes are remembered and the successes are refined, then within a few generations, a community can accumulate a functional pharmacy. That kind of accumulation requires teachers, and teachers require age. The pharmacy of the forest is not something a person can carry alone. It is something a community must carry, and a community must carry it across generations. Ancient DNA is beginning to give us glimpses of this transmission. At sites where multiple individuals from the same community are preserved, researchers can compare their genomes and reconstruct family relationships. At the Sunghir site in Russia, for example, DNA analysis has shown that the buried individuals were not close relatives, suggesting that the community was structured in a way that mixed genetic lineages. At other sites, the pattern is different. At El Sidron, the Neanderthal DNA suggests a small, closely related group, possibly with matrilocal residence, meaning that women stayed and men moved between groups. In such a community, older women would have been the anchors of continuity, holding the knowledge that outlasted individual lives, being the librarians of a library nobody had written down. There is also biological evidence for the grandmother effect in the human body itself. Human menopause, unlike similar phenomena in a few other species such as certain whales, is thought to be an adaptation, not merely a byproduct of extended life. It reflects a real evolutionary bargain. Women stop reproducing earlier than they would otherwise, and in exchange they invest in the offspring of their daughters. That bargain is only worth making if the older woman is contributing something to the survival of those grandchildren. Food is part of it. Childcare is part of it. But knowledge, particularly knowledge of dangerous and useful plants, is likely to be a large part as well. The grandmother who knows what to do when the toddler burns with fever is the grandmother whose grandchildren survive to have children of their own. Even at a molecular level, the grandmother hypothesis has begun to leave signatures. Studies of gene variants involved in longevity, in cognitive maintenance in older ages, and in the regulation of immune function have identified alleles that appear to have been under positive selection in the human lineage. Some of these variants are shared with Neanderthals. Some are unique to modern humans. The details are still being worked out, but the general picture is consistent. Evolution seems to have shaped us to live long, to remember well, and to teach effectively. Those are not accidental traits. They are adaptations. And they are the adaptations of a species that has always needed elders to survive. There is a poignant human meaning in all of this. The image of a grandmother stripping bark from a poplar, chewing it soft, and pressing it into the aching gums of a granddaughter is not sentimental fiction. It is a scene that, in all likelihood, happened many thousands of times across the Paleolithic. It happened in Africa. It happened in the Zagros Mountains. It happened in the caves of the Iberian Peninsula and the plains of Central Europe. Wherever human beings and their close relatives lived, and wherever grandmothers survived long enough to teach, something like it was probably happening. The scene is not preserved in any single artifact, but it is written into the shape of our life history and into the residues of the plants we chewed. Now, we should be careful not to romanticize this. Not every prehistoric grandmother was a healer. Not every prehistoric community had the same structure. Some Paleolithic populations may have had short life expectancies and few elders. Others may have relied on men, or on younger women, or on specialized individuals of any age. The archaeological record shows variation, and the ethnographic record shows variation, and we should expect that the deep past showed variation too. But the general pattern, the pattern of accumulated knowledge held by long-lived individuals and transmitted across generations, appears to be very old and very widespread. It also appears to have been essential, because when we look at the survivors, the people whose bones show healed injuries and whose calculus shows medicinal residues, we are looking at people who benefited from that knowledge. They did not heal alone. They healed inside a network of care that stretched back through their mothers and grandmothers and forward through their children and grandchildren. That network is the first hospital. It has no walls, it has no doors, it has no name, but it kept people alive for thousands of years before writing, before farming, before anything we usually call civilization. And ancient DNA is finally letting us see, in the traces of plants in ancient teeth and the shape of healed ancient bones, that it was real. Chapter 5. When Species Met and Medicine Traveled. For a long time, the story of modern humans coming out of Africa was told as a story of replacement. We arrived, they departed. The Neanderthals disappeared. The Denisovans disappeared. Whatever other archaic human populations existed in Eurasia disappeared. And we, Homo sapiens, inherited the earth alone. It was a clean narrative. It suited a certain kind of 19th and 20th century imagination. And it was, once again, almost entirely wrong. The first shock came in 2010, when a team led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology announced that they had sequenced a draft of the Neanderthal genome. When they compared that genome to modern human genomes, they found something they had not expected. Non-African modern humans carried Neanderthal DNA, not trace amounts, real amounts. On average, between 1 and 2% of the genome of a person of European or Asian descent is Neanderthal in origin. Some individuals carry more. Some Neanderthal segments appear at high frequency in modern populations, suggesting that they were beneficial and selected for. Other segments have been purged, suggesting they caused problems. But the overall picture is clear. Our ancestors did not merely encounter Neanderthals, they interbred with them, and they carried the results forward into every generation that has followed. A few years later, another shock arrived. The Denisovans, an archaic human population known primarily from a finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, turned out to have contributed genetic material to modern human populations as well. In particular, modern populations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Pacific carry small but significant amounts of Denisovan DNA. In some Melanesian populations, Denisovan ancestry reaches 4 or 5%. Genetic exchange between our species and other archaic populations was not a rare accident. It was apparently a repeated feature of our history, a pattern of meeting and mating that occurred wherever populations encountered one another over tens of thousands of years. Why does this matter for the story of the first healers? It matters because among the genetic segments we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans are variants involved in immunity. Specifically, several genes that shape how the human immune system recognizes and responds to pathogens carry Neanderthal or Denisovan versions. These include genes in the human leukocyte antigen system, which is central to immune identification of infected cells. They include genes involved in the innate immune response, which is the body's first line of defense against microbes. And they include genes involved in the response to viruses, including some viruses that have shaped human evolution over the last 100,000 years. The implication is significant. When modern humans left Africa, they encountered new diseases in new environments. Some of those diseases had already been shaping the immune systems of Neanderthals and Denisovans for hundreds of thousands of years. When our ancestors interbred with those archaic populations, they inherited, along with everything else, a set of immunological tools already adapted to local pathogens. It was a shortcut. It was, in effect, a form of biological medicine, passed from one species to another through the intimate transaction of reproduction. The first healers, in some sense, were not only the ones who chewed poplar bark, they were also the mothers and fathers who exchanged genes across species lines, and whose descendants carried those genes forward into every corner of the world that humans would eventually inhabit. This is not the same as saying that Neanderthals or Denisovans directly practiced medicine on modern humans. There is no evidence for that. What we have is evidence that genetic material flowed between populations, and that some of that material had medical consequences. In modern populations, certain Neanderthal-derived variants are associated with different risks for autoimmune disease, for allergies, for viral susceptibility, and for other conditions. Some of these variants may have been advantageous in the past, when the pathogen landscape was different and neutral or slightly harmful today. Others may still be advantageous. The picture is complex, but the fact of the exchange is undeniable, and the medical consequences of the exchange are still being catalogued. There is another layer to this story, one that ancient DNA has only recently begun to reveal. The bacteria and viruses that live in our bodies also have long histories, and those histories can be read. Certain strains of Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium that lives in human stomachs and sometimes causes ulcers, have been present in human populations for at least 100,000 years, and possibly much longer. Different modern human populations carry different H. pylori strains, and those strains can be used to trace the movements of populations across continents. Tuberculosis, malaria, herpes, hepatitis, and other diseases have similarly long and traceable histories. Ancient DNA can, in some cases, detect these pathogens directly in ancient remains. It can identify tuberculosis in a Neolithic farmer, or plague in a Bronze Age nomad, or hepatitis in an early medieval Christian, and it can begin to reconstruct how those diseases moved with people and how people responded to them across the generations. When a disease enters a population that has never encountered it, the results are usually devastating. When the disease returns generation after generation, the population, over time, evolves resistance. That evolution takes many forms. Some of it involves changes in immune genes. Some of it involves changes in immune genes. Some of it involves changes in immune genes, in the plants and substances people consume. And some of it undoubtedly involves the accumulation of medical knowledge. The first populations to encounter tuberculosis probably suffered enormously. Later populations, having inherited both genetic adaptations and cultural knowledge, would have suffered less. Both forms of inheritance matter. Both are part of the story of prehistoric healing, and both left traces that ancient DNA can now read. The interbreeding events between modern humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans also had another consequence, which we are only beginning to understand. They may have facilitated the transfer of cultural knowledge as well as genetic material. When a Neanderthal woman had a child with a modern human man, or a modern human woman had a child with a Denisovan man, the resulting child grew up in a specific cultural environment. That environment carried practices, beliefs, and pieces of information. It is entirely plausible that some of what modern humans knew about medicine, some of the specific plants they used, and the specific techniques they applied, came originally from the archaic populations they encountered. We have no way to prove this directly, but we know that cultural exchange happens whenever populations meet, and we know that the meetings between our species were prolonged and intimate. It would be surprising if no medical knowledge crossed those lines. Ancient DNA has begun to give us hints of specific cases. In modern Tibetan populations, for example, a genetic variant that helps with living at high altitude appears to have been inherited from Denisovans. That variant, called EPAS1, allows Tibetans to thrive in an oxygen-poor environment where lowland populations often develop chronic altitude sickness. Whether this variant was originally advantageous to Denisovans in the same way, or whether it took on new significance when it entered the Tibetan population, is still being investigated. But the fact of its Denisovan origin is clear. Modern Tibetan medicine, in a real sense, has archaic human roots, and every Tibetan farmer walking a high pass today carries a small piece of a Denisovan ancestor who breathed the thin air of Central Asia perhaps 100,000 years before. Similar stories are emerging elsewhere. Variants involved in cold adaptation appear to have Neanderthal origins. Variants involved in skin pigmentation, in metabolism, in body hair, in the response to certain infections, all show archaic contributions. Some of these variants are neutral, some are advantageous, some are harmful in modern environments but were advantageous in past ones. The mosaic of the modern human genome, we now understand, is a record of thousands of encounters and thousands of exchanges. Each variant is a small piece of history, and some of those pieces, taken together, tell us that the first healers were not confined to any single species. They were a network of populations, learning from one another, dying for one another, and sometimes, quite literally, giving birth to one another across the boundaries we once thought were unbreakable. This is a remarkable picture, and it is one that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. The idea that Neanderthals and modern humans mated with each other, that they raised children together, that some of their descendants are still walking around today, was considered fringe speculation until the moment the DNA proved it. Now it is textbook fact. And the further we go, the richer the story becomes. Every new genome, every new site, every new sequence adds new details. The first healers, we are beginning to see, were part of a shared human effort that reached across the boundaries we once thought were unbreakable. What ancient DNA has taught us, more than anything else, is that those boundaries were always more porous than we imagined, and that the deep history of human care and human medicine is a story of many species learning to survive together, and sometimes failing to survive together, and always leaving traces of both the trying and the failing in the genes that outlive them. Chapter 6. The Plague that Rewrote the Balance of Power. For most of the 20th century, if you had asked when plague first appeared in human history, you would have been told, roughly, the 6th century of the Common Era. The plague of Justinian, striking the Byzantine Empire in 541, was considered the first great outbreak, followed 1,000 years later by the Black Death of medieval Europe. That was the story. Plague was a disease of the late historical period, imported into unlucky populations by the caravans and ships of the ancient and medieval world, and dramatic mainly because it arrived in a Europe that had, until then, been spared. Ancient DNA has demolished that timeline. In the last decade, researchers have detected the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of plague, in the remains of individuals who died 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and in some cases even earlier. The plague did not arrive with the Byzantine Empire. It has been with us for the entire second half of the Holocene, and possibly longer. It moved with the first farmers, with the first herders, with the first city dwellers. It killed in prehistoric Europe. It killed in prehistoric Asia. And it left, alongside its victims, evidence of how those populations tried to fight back with the tools they had at hand. The earliest confirmed cases of Yersinia pestis in ancient DNA come from Bronze Age sites in Eurasia, dating to around 3,000 years before the present. But more recent work has pushed the date earlier still. In 2018, a team analysing remains from a Neolithic farming community in what is now Sweden detected Yersinia pestis DNA in a young woman who had died some 4,900 years ago. The strain she carried was ancestral to all later plague strains, but it was already recognisably plague, already deadly, already spreading through her community. Her community, in fact, appears to have collapsed shortly after her death. The archaeological signature of that collapse, sudden abandonment of settlements, mass burials, and demographic reduction, matches what we would expect from a plague outbreak in a population with no immunity, no antibiotics, and no understanding of what was killing them. Similar findings have emerged from other Neolithic and Bronze Age sites across Europe and Asia. The pattern is consistent. Wherever agriculture and dense settlement appeared, and wherever people began to live alongside domesticated animals and stored grain, plague and other epidemic diseases followed. The Neolithic Revolution, which we usually celebrate as the birth of civilization, was also the birth of epidemic disease at scale. Cities and farms fed pathogens, and pathogens in turn reshaped populations, sometimes erasing them, sometimes reducing them to a fraction of what they had been. Now, how does this connect to the story of the first healers? It connects in several ways. First, it tells us that the pressure on medical knowledge intensified dramatically with the transition to farming. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile groups, were largely spared from epidemic disease. Their pathogens were chronic, familial, and slow, but with agriculture came new diseases, appearing suddenly and killing quickly. Communities that had accumulated medical knowledge over thousands of years now had to apply that knowledge to problems it had never faced. Some succeeded, many did not. The healers who had learned to treat a broken leg or a snake bite now had to face something that spread invisibly and killed within days. Second, ancient DNA has begun to reveal how populations responded, genetically, to the arrival of epidemic disease. In studies of ancient European remains before and after the arrival of plague, researchers have detected shifts in the frequency of immune-related genes. Some variants that protect against Yersinia pestis and similar pathogens became more common after outbreaks. This is natural selection in real time. The people who happened to carry the right variants survived. Their children carried those variants forward. Over generations, the population as a whole became slightly more resistant. This is one of the most direct demonstrations of Darwinian selection ever recovered from the archaeological record. And it happened because of disease. And it happened within timescales short enough that ancient DNA can measure them. Third, ancient DNA has allowed researchers to reconstruct the routes by which epidemic disease spread. By comparing the genomes of Yersinia pestis found at different sites and at different times, scientists can build phylogenetic trees of the bacterium. Those trees mirror, roughly, the movements of human populations. Plague appears to have originated somewhere in Central Asia and spread westward and eastward with the movements of Bronze Age peoples. It arrived in Europe several times, in several distinct waves. It arrived in East Asia. It arrived in the Near East. And it left, in every population it touched, both a demographic footprint and a genetic one that can still be read millennia later. Now, imagine what it was like to be a healer in one of these communities. You have inherited generations of knowledge about the plants of your landscape. You know which ones to use for fever, which for pain, which for infection, which for injury. You have used them for years, perhaps decades. Then, one summer, people start dying. First one, then 5, then 20. The illness is unlike anything you have seen. It comes on suddenly, with fever, with swellings in the neck and groin, with delirium, with death within days. Your remedies do not work. Your patients die despite your care. Your family dies. Your neighbors die. Your community, in some cases, ceases to exist. You do everything you were taught, and everything fails. This is not speculation. This is what ancient DNA and archaeology together suggest happened in Neolithic Europe. Populations collapsed, villages emptied, cultures changed, and the survivors, both genetically and culturally, were the ones who had, by accident or by adaptation, some form of protection. They may have been the ones with slightly different immune genes. They may have been the ones whose healers, by chance or by insight, tried treatments that helped. They may have been the ones who lived in slightly less dense settlements, or who moved when the disease appeared, or who buried their dead in ways that limited further transmission. The survivors, in effect, carried forward both a smaller population and a lesson written in loss. We should not overstate what prehistoric healers could do against plague. In the modern world, without antibiotics, untreated pneumonic plague kills nearly 100% of those infected, and untreated bubonic plague kills more than half. Whatever herbal preparations Neolithic healers used, they would not have cured plague, but they might have eased symptoms. They might have kept some patients alive long enough for their own immune systems to fight back. They might have practiced forms of quarantine or isolation, learned from earlier experience with less deadly diseases, and they would have accumulated knowledge, painfully, from each outbreak that could be passed to the next generation, along with the memory of what had been tried and what had failed. Ancient DNA can even give us hints of specific treatments that may have been tried. In some Neolithic sites where plague is detected, dental calculus from the same or similar individuals shows unusual concentrations of specific plants. In some cases, those plants have known antimicrobial or immune-stimulating properties. In others, they are simply plants that would have been available. The correspondence is not always tight, and the causation is impossible to prove. But the pattern suggests that healers were trying. They were reaching for anything that might help. They were experimenting with the lives of their patients and their own, in the desperate hope of finding something that worked, and they were doing so in the absence of any germ theory or any understanding of what was actually killing the people they were trying to save. The lesson of plague in prehistory is not that our ancestors defeated it. They did not. Yersinia pestis kept returning, in wave after wave, and continued to shape human demography for thousands of years. The lesson is that medical knowledge accumulated in the face of disaster. Every outbreak taught something. Every survivor carried both the memory of what had been lost and the beginnings of what might be tried next time. That memory did not vanish when the last body was buried. It passed into the practices of the next generation and the generation after that, and eventually, thousands of years later, into the beginnings of what we now call medicine, along with the deep human intuition that some diseases spread from person to person and that keeping distance can save lives. There is a hard truth in all of this. Some of what our ancestors learned about healing, they learned by watching people die. They learned by trying remedies that did not work. They learned by burying children they had tried and failed to save. Ancient DNA cannot give us the emotional record of those failures, but it gives us the demographic record. It shows the mass graves, it shows the sudden absences, and it shows, In the survivors, the slow accumulation of both genetic and cultural resistance. The first healers were not always successful, but they were always trying. And their trying, over millennia, is the reason we are here, breathing air that no longer terrifies us the way it once terrified them. Chapter 7. The Central Revelation. There is a moment in any long investigation when the pieces suddenly fit together, and the shape they form is not the shape you expected. In the study of ancient DNA and the first healers, that moment has arrived within the last several years, quietly, through the accumulation of many separate findings into a single picture. The picture is not one that would have been predicted a generation ago. It is, in its own way, more radical than any of us anticipated. And it is worth stating clearly, because it changes how we think about the deep past of medicine and about the depth of what it means to be human. The revelation is this: healing, in something recognizable as a systematic practice, is much older than our species. It is older than agriculture. It is older than language as we know it. It may be as old as the genus Homo itself, and possibly older. The evidence for this comes from multiple lines of ancient DNA and physical anthropology, and each line points in the same direction. When we combine the healed injuries in Neanderthal skeletons, the medicinal plant residues in Neanderthal dental calculus, the burial practices at multiple Neanderthal and archaic sites, the genetic evidence for immune adaptation across species, and the patterns of survival in individuals who should not have survived, we arrive at a conclusion that would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. The first healers were not modern humans. They were, or included, our archaic relatives, and they were doing this work long before we imagined it possible. Let us walk carefully through the evidence, because the claim is significant, and the reader deserves to follow the reasoning without shortcuts. First, the Neanderthal evidence. At sites across Eurasia, from Shanidar in Iraq to La Chapelle in France to El Sidron in Spain, Neanderthals were surviving injuries that should have killed them. They were living into ages that required sustained care from other members of their group. They were being buried, in at least some cases, with what appears to be intention and ritual. They were, per the calculus evidence, consuming plants with clear medicinal properties, and they were doing this, importantly, before any significant modern human presence in Europe. The El Sidron individual with the aspirin-producing poplar in her mouth died some 49,000 years ago. That is thousands of years before modern humans had firmly established themselves in northern Spain. Whatever knowledge she had, she did not learn it from us. Whatever she was doing it as a Neanderthal, in a Neanderthal community, drawing on Neanderthal traditions that stretched back into a past we cannot easily see. Second, the Denisovan evidence. Denisovans are known from far fewer physical remains than Neanderthals, so we know less about their behavior directly. But we know their genome, and we know that they contributed variants to modern humans that influence immune function and adaptation to specific environments. We know that they persisted for hundreds of thousands of years across large parts of Asia. We know that they interbred not only with modern humans but also with Neanderthals, creating hybrid individuals whose remains have been recovered from Siberian caves. Whatever cultural systems they had, they must have been sophisticated enough to sustain a widespread and long-lived population under difficult conditions. It is reasonable to think, though we cannot yet prove it in the same detail, that Denisovans also practiced forms of care and healing suited to their world. Third, the archaic African evidence. Ancient DNA is beginning to reveal that the human family tree in Africa was, and is, more complex than we long believed. There were multiple archaic populations living in Africa at various times, some of which interbred with the ancestors of modern humans. Some of those populations may have contributed variants to modern African genomes that we are only beginning to identify. The full picture is not yet clear, but it is becoming clearer that modern humans did not emerge from a single small group in a single place. We emerged from a network of populations, exchanging genes, exchanging knowledge, and, in all likelihood, exchanging practices related to survival, injury, and disease. The African branches of our tree are as tangled and as rich as any others, and they may hold more of the origin story of medicine than we currently understand. Fourth, the timing evidence. The earliest signs of medicinal plant use, of care for the injured, and of ritualized burial all predate the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Some of these signs go back 400,000 years or more. That is deep. That is, in evolutionary terms, before the modern human brain took its current shape. It suggests that healing, or something like it, was practiced by ancestors we would not have recognized as fully modern. And it suggests, more radically, that the capacity to care for one another may be one of the oldest and most conserved traits in our lineage. It may be part of what made us into a lineage in the first place. Now, we must qualify all of this carefully. Not every healed bone means a healer. Not every plant residue means intentional medicine. Not every burial means ritual understanding of death. There is legitimate debate about the interpretation of specific pieces of evidence. Some researchers argue that Neanderthal burials were opportunistic rather than intentional. Some argue that plant residues in calculus reflect food rather than medicine. Some argue that survival with injury reflects individual toughness rather than group care. These are serious arguments, and honest inquiry must engage them without dismissing them. But when we step back and look at the totality of the evidence, from multiple sites, from multiple species, from multiple time periods, from multiple lines of inquiry, the pattern is coherent. It is not the case that one Neanderthal happened to survive an injury by luck. It is not the case that one archaic individual accidentally chewed the right bark. The pattern of care and treatment appears repeatedly, across geographies and across tens of thousands of years. Chance does not produce that kind of consistency. Systematic practice does. And systematic practice is what we are looking at, whether we choose to call it medicine or not. And systematic practice implies knowledge. Knowledge implies teachers. Teachers imply communities that value teaching. And communities that value teaching imply, at some level, a shared understanding of the value of human life, even human life in its most fragile forms. That is the central revelation. Our capacity to care for one another and to develop and transmit knowledge about how to do it is not a recent invention. It is not something civilization gave us. It is something we brought to civilization from a much deeper past. Neanderthals had it. Denisovans probably had it. And when our own species emerged, we inherited it, both genetically and culturally, from ancestors who had already been practicing it for a very long time. There is a further implication, which follows from all of this, and which is perhaps the most surprising part of the central revelation. When we look for the origins of medicine, we usually look forward, from the Paleolithic toward the Neolithic, from the Neolithic toward the Bronze Age, from the Bronze Age toward the first written medical texts of Egypt and Mesopotamia and China. We treat medicine as something that developed over time, becoming more sophisticated as human societies became more complex. But the ancient DNA evidence suggests that the direction of development was not simply upward, it was also, in many ways, sideways. Different populations developed different medical traditions based on different local plants, different local diseases, and different local social structures. When those populations came into contact, they exchanged knowledge. Some of it was preserved, some was lost. What we call modern medicine is one particular tradition among many that ever existed, and it is far from being the sum of all human medical wisdom. Ancient DNA is beginning to give us glimpses of medical traditions that have long since vanished. When we analyze the plants in the calculus of a Neolithic farmer in Anatolia, we are recovering a fragment of a medical system that existed nowhere else on Earth. When we analyze the immune variants in a Denisovan tooth, we are recovering a fragment of an adaptation that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and that has left only quiet traces in modern populations. Every skeleton, every calculus sample, every ancient genome is a partial record of a lost world of healing. Most of that world will never be recovered, but some of it can be, and what we have recovered so far is enough to change how we think about the whole story, and enough to make us wonder what else is still waiting inside teeth we have not yet examined. Here, then, is the central revelation stated as directly as the evidence allows. The first healers were not us. They were older than us. They were, in some cases, other species entirely. They laid down, over hundreds of thousands of years, the foundations of a knowledge system that we inherited, adapted, and eventually wrote down. When we take an aspirin today, we are participating in a chain of practice that stretches back, without break, to a young Neanderthal woman chewing poplar in a cave in Spain 49,000 years ago. When we care for a family member who cannot care for themselves, we are echoing behaviors that were already ancient when the first modern humans looked out of Africa toward a world full of other kinds of humans. Medicine is not a modern achievement. It is a deep human and deeply human inheritance. And ancient DNA has finally given us the tools to see how far back it goes and to understand that it goes further still. That is what the evidence tells us. That is the story ancient DNA is writing. The chapters that follow will explore what happened next, as this ancient inheritance made its way through the transitions of the Neolithic, through the encounters of the Bronze Age, and eventually into the world of the first written medical traditions. But we should not lose sight of what came before. Long before there were doctors, there were healers. And long before there were healers who left their names, there were healers who left their teeth. And their teeth have finally begun to speak. And what they are saying is that we have never been alone in this work. Chapter 8. The Farmers, the Fevers, and the Fields of Death. If the Paleolithic was the long, deep root of prehistoric medicine, the Neolithic was the moment when the root met a storm. The transition from foraging to farming, which began in different parts of the world at different times, but was well underway in the Near East by about 10,000 years ago, changed everything about human life. It changed what people ate. It changed how they lived. It changed how many of them there were. And it changed, in ways ancient DNA is only now allowing us to see, what diseases they carried, and how those diseases moved through their communities. Before agriculture, most human populations were small. They moved regularly. They lived in low-density groups, scattered across large territories. Under these conditions, epidemic diseases have a hard time spreading. A virus that kills its host too quickly runs out of new hosts. A bacterium that requires close contact for transmission has few opportunities. Chronic diseases certainly existed. Parasites existed. Traumatic injuries and infections from injuries existed. But large-scale epidemics, the kind that could wipe out entire villages in a season, were rare or absent. The Paleolithic was not disease-free, but it was disease-slow. With agriculture, this changed. People settled in one place. Populations grew. Villages became towns. Domesticated animals lived alongside humans, creating opportunities for zoonotic disease transfer, the movement of pathogens from animals into people. Stored grain attracted rodents, which brought new diseases. Human waste accumulated near living spaces, creating conditions for fecal-oral transmission of pathogens. In short, the Neolithic Revolution created the conditions for epidemic disease to flourish for the first time in human history. What we usually think of as progress was also, from the perspective of pathogens, opportunity. Ancient DNA has documented this transition in remarkable detail. Studies of Neolithic and Bronze Age remains from Europe, Asia, and the Near East have identified pathogens including Yersinia pestis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, Salmonella enterica, hepatitis B virus, and others. Each of these pathogens has its own history, but the pattern is broadly similar. They appear at low frequency in early Neolithic populations, become more common as populations grow and settlements become denser, and cause repeated outbreaks over the following millennia. Consider tuberculosis. Ancient DNA studies have detected Mycobacterium tuberculosis in human remains dating back at least 9,000 years, from a Neolithic site off the coast of what is now Israel. In this and other early cases, the disease appears in individuals who lived in sedentary farming communities. Skeletal changes consistent with chronic tuberculosis, such as spinal deformities from pot disease, become more common in populations after the shift to agriculture. Tuberculosis is transmitted primarily through prolonged close contact, particularly indoors, which makes it a disease of settled life. It has been with us for thousands of years, and it is still with us, and the ancient DNA record shows just how deeply it is woven into human history. Consider hepatitis B. In a large study published in 2018, researchers extracted hepatitis B virus DNA from the remains of individuals across Eurasia, dating from the Bronze Age to the Middle Ages. The results showed that the virus has been circulating in human populations for at least 7,000 years, and possibly much longer. Different strains dominated in different regions and different periods. Some strains went extinct. Some are ancestral to the strains that still circulate today. The virus, in effect, has its own history, moving with people, evolving alongside them, sometimes causing severe disease and sometimes coexisting quietly like a lodger who never announces himself. For the first healers of these Neolithic and Bronze Age communities, this was a new landscape. They faced diseases their predecessors had never encountered, or had encountered only rarely. Their inherited knowledge, developed for the injuries and infections of a foraging life, had to be adapted, extended, and in some cases replaced. Some of that adaptation left traces in the archaeological and DNA records, and some of it, inevitably, was lost when the communities that carried it collapsed under the weight of the diseases they were trying to fight. At many Neolithic sites, the botanical evidence in dental calculus shifts as populations become more dependent on agriculture. Some plants that were common in Paleolithic mouths become rare. Others become more common. Certain plants known ethnobotanically for their use against infectious disease appear at higher frequencies in populations that show evidence of chronic infection. Whether this represents deliberate medical practice or general dietary shifts is not always clear, but the correspondence in some cases is striking, and it suggests that healers were adjusting their pharmacies to match the new pattern of illness. At the same time, cultural evidence of specialized medical practice begins to appear. In some Neolithic communities, particular individuals are buried with objects that later cultures would associate with healers or ritual specialists. These may include unusual collections of bone, stone, or plant material, or objects whose function is not immediately obvious. The interpretation of such burials is always tentative, but the pattern suggests that as diseases became more complex, so did the roles of the people who tried to treat them. Healing may have moved from being an activity distributed across most adults, especially older women, toward being at least partially the province of specialists who devoted more of their time and attention to the problem. Ancient DNA has also provided a striking view of another aspect of Neolithic medicine, the use of trepanation. Trepanation is the practice of cutting a hole in the skull, presumably to relieve pressure, treat headache, or address other conditions. It appears in the archaeological record at least 8,000 years ago and is found across multiple continents. Skulls with clear evidence of trepanation and with clear evidence of healing around the wound indicate that many patients survived the procedure. Some skulls show multiple trepanations, performed over time, all with signs of healing. Someone was doing this. Someone was surviving it, and someone was learning to do it better, refining the technique from one patient to the next. Ancient DNA cannot tell us directly why trepanation was performed, but it can tell us about the health status of the individuals who received it. In some cases, trepanned skulls belong to individuals with signs of chronic infection or of trauma to the head that might plausibly have caused symptoms. In other cases, no obvious pathology is present, suggesting the procedure may have had a ritual or preventive purpose. The variation is important. It shows that trepanation was not a single practice with a single meaning. It was a technique that different communities used in different ways, for different reasons, over thousands of years, and it demonstrates that Neolithic healers were willing to attempt surgical intervention when other methods failed. The Neolithic and Bronze Age were also the periods in which the first written medical traditions began to emerge in some parts of the world. In Mesopotamia, medical tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE list plants, minerals, and animal products used for specific conditions. In Egypt, medical papyri from the 2nd millennium BCE describe surgical procedures, treatments for wounds, and remedies for various ailments. In China, medical texts from the 1st millennium BCE codify centuries of accumulated practice. In India, the Ayurvedic tradition, whose written form dates to a similar period, records treatments and philosophies that reach much further back into prehistory. These written traditions did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from the vast oral tradition that had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years, refined by the pressures of Neolithic disease, extended by the innovations of settled life, and finally captured in writing when writing itself became available. The medical texts of Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and India are, in effect, snapshots of much older knowledge. The plants they list, the diseases they treat, the philosophies they express, all have roots that stretch far deeper than the tablets and papyri that record them. Ancient DNA has begun to connect the written record to the prehistoric one. When researchers analyze the plants mentioned in early medical texts and compare them to the plants detected in dental calculus from earlier periods, they find substantial overlap. Some of the same species used in Bronze Age Egyptian medicine were being consumed by Neolithic Anatolian farmers. Some of the plants prescribed in early Chinese texts were being chewed by Paleolithic foragers thousands of years earlier. The written tradition, in other words, is a formalization of what had already existed for a very long time, and the scribes who first pressed reeds into clay were recording knowledge that had been carried in mouths and hands for 100 generations before them. This should not surprise us, but it is worth stating clearly. The first written medical traditions did not invent medicine, they inherited it, and the further back we trace the inheritance, the more clearly we see that medicine, in its practical, embodied, plant-based, and community-centered form, was one of the oldest continuous human activities. It changed with each new environment, with each new disease, with each new social structure. But it did not begin with writing. It began, as far as we can tell, with the earliest members of our lineage who had the capacity to remember, to teach, and to care. The Neolithic did not create healers. It challenged them, extended them, and specialized them. And ancient DNA, in the last 2 decades, has finally given us the tools to see how they responded. What we see is not always heroic. There are collapses and failures. There are diseases that overwhelmed communities. There are treatments that did not work. But there is also, throughout, the persistence of the same essential activity. People trying to understand what was wrong with other people and trying, sometimes successfully, to make it better. Chapter 9. The debate about what we can really know. Any documentary that claims to reveal the deep past must be honest about what it does not know and about where legitimate scholars disagree. Ancient DNA is a powerful tool, but it is not omniscient. Its interpretations are constrained by the evidence, by the technology, and by the assumptions researchers bring to the analysis. In the case of the first healers, several important debates continue, and no responsible account can ignore them. To pretend otherwise would be to trade real understanding for the illusion of certainty. The first debate concerns the interpretation of dental calculus. When researchers extract DNA and other residues from ancient plaque, they find a mixture of substances. Some of that mixture reflects deliberate consumption. Some reflects incidental exposure. Some reflects contamination from the environment, from other individuals in the same burial, or from the modern people handling the samples. Separating these sources is difficult, and the field has developed increasingly rigorous protocols to control for contamination. But even in the best-studied cases, some ambiguity remains, and honest researchers acknowledge that ambiguity rather than pretending it away. Take the El Sidron Neanderthal woman, with poplar and penicillium in her calculus. The interpretation offered by the original researchers was that she was self-medicating for her dental abscess. That interpretation is compelling, but it is not the only one available. An alternative interpretation is that she was consuming poplar as part of a broader dietary pattern that had nothing specifically to do with her toothache. Some hunter-gatherer populations do chew bark and leaves of various trees for various reasons, not all of them medical. The penicillium could reflect environmental contamination or the consumption of moldy stored food. In either case, the specific link between her illness and her diet becomes less certain, and the case moves from strong to merely suggestive. Most researchers still find the medicinal interpretation more likely, because the correspondence between her illness and the properties of the substances she consumed is so specific. But it is worth noting that the interpretation depends on inference, and that reasonable scholars can disagree about the strength of the case. This is how science should work. It is not a series of announcements. It is a conversation, sometimes contentious, always ongoing. A second debate concerns the meaning of survival with injury. As discussed earlier, healed injuries in ancient skeletons are often taken as evidence of care and support from other members of the community. But some researchers argue that this interpretation goes beyond what the bones can show. A person can survive some injuries alone if the injury is not immediately fatal and the environment is not too harsh. Chimpanzees, for example, are known to survive some quite serious injuries without significant assistance from other chimps. Perhaps Neanderthals and early modern humans were similarly resilient, and the healed injuries reflect individual toughness rather than group support. This argument has real force in some cases, but it becomes weaker as the injuries become more severe. A Neanderthal with one arm and one blind eye and severe arthritis is not surviving alone in the mountains of Iraq for years. A 12-year-old with a congenital deformity that leaves him barely able to walk is not living to adolescence in the mammoth steppe of Ice Age Russia without help. In the specific cases where care is most strongly inferred, the injuries are severe enough that individual survival becomes implausible. The debate is really about which cases fall into which category, not about whether care ever occurred. and most scholars now accept that at least some cases require the care hypothesis. A third debate concerns the interpretation of Neanderthal burials. Some Neanderthal sites, including Shanidar, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, La Pharmacies, and others, contain remains that appear to have been deliberately buried. In some cases, the burials include what look like grave goods, arrangements of stones, or other features that suggest ritual intention. The famous Shanidar 4 flowers, mentioned at the opening of this documentary, were originally interpreted as evidence that Neanderthals placed flowers on their dead as part of a funerary ritual. That interpretation has been challenged. Some researchers argue that the pollen at Shanidar 4 could have been brought in by burrowing rodents, or by later human activity, or by natural processes. Others argue that even if the pollen represents intentional flower placement, this does not necessarily reflect the kind of ritual understanding that we would associate with modern human funerals. The debate continues, and it matters, because it touches on questions of Neanderthal cognition and symbolic capacity, and because how we answer it shapes how we imagine the minds of our closest extinct relatives. More recent excavations at Shanidar, however, have added new evidence. In 2020, researchers announced the discovery of a new Neanderthal individual at Shanidar, dubbed Shanidar Z, whose remains showed clear signs of deliberate deposition in what appears to be a burial context. The individual was placed in a specific position, in a specific location within the cave, in a way that is difficult to explain without invoking some intentional practice. Whether we call it burial in the fullest ritual sense, or simply deliberate disposal, it represents a level of care for the dead that goes beyond mere disposal. And where there is care for the dead, there is, plausibly, care for the living. A fourth debate concerns the extent to which medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. Some researchers argue that Paleolithic populations, given their small sizes and their vulnerability to demographic disruption, may have frequently lost knowledge. A single bad winter, a single disease outbreak, a single conflict that killed the elders could wipe out generations of accumulated wisdom. In this view, medical knowledge in the deep past was fragile, and much of what was learned in one century might have been lost by the next, with each subsequent generation forced to relearn much of what its ancestors had known. Other researchers push back on this view. They point to the persistence of certain plant identifications across vast time periods and to the shared elements of ethnobotanical knowledge across widely separated hunter-gatherer societies today, as evidence that knowledge transmission was robust. In this view, the essential facts about which plants worked for which conditions were sturdy enough to survive most demographic shocks, because they were embedded in ordinary daily life and shared widely across the community. Both positions have merit, and the truth probably varies by region, period, and specific piece of knowledge. Some knowledge was fragile, some was durable. The mixture is what we would expect from any long-standing oral tradition. A fifth debate concerns the role of ancient DNA itself in shaping our understanding. Some scholars have raised concerns that the field has moved too quickly, that the technology has outrun the interpretive frameworks needed to make sense of the data, and that dramatic findings have sometimes been announced with insufficient consideration of alternative explanations. The concerns are not about the science per se, but about how it is communicated and how it interacts with older archaeological traditions. There is truth in this concern. The rapid pace of ancient DNA research has sometimes led to sweeping claims that later evidence has had to walk back. The initial reports of the Neanderthal genome, for example, emphasized how similar Neanderthals were to modern humans, while later reports have highlighted important differences, including in genes affecting brain development and immune function. The picture is more complex than early accounts suggested, and the field is still refining its understanding. Each new sample adds nuance, and sometimes contradiction, to what came before. But refinement is not the same as retraction. The core findings, that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, that archaic populations contributed to modern human genomes, that ancient DNA can be recovered from dental calculus and used to reconstruct diets and disease exposures, are solid and have been replicated many times. What continues to be refined are the details, the interpretations, and the implications. That is how science works, and that is how science should work, and it is a strength of the field, rather than a weakness, that its findings are subject to ongoing scrutiny. For our purposes, the key point is that the story of the first healers, as revealed by ancient DNA, is a story built on multiple lines of evidence that converge. No single line, taken alone, would be conclusive. The healed injuries could be dismissed as luck. The medicinal residues could be dismissed as dietary noise. The burial practices could be dismissed as opportunistic. The genetic exchanges could be dismissed as biologically interesting but medically irrelevant. But taken together, and reinforced by the consistency of the patterns across sites and species and time periods, they build a case that is difficult to dismiss, and that becomes harder to dismiss with every new study that adds to the record. The case is not that we know exactly what any specific prehistoric healer knew, or exactly how they thought about their work, or exactly what they said to their patients as they applied their remedies. Those things are lost, and no technology will recover them. The case is that a systematic practice of care and treatment, drawing on knowledge of plants and injuries and diseases, existed among human and near-human populations for a very long time, and that this practice was one of the important activities that shaped who we became. It was not the only such activity. Tool-making mattered, language mattered, fire mattered, cooperation in hunting mattered, but healing mattered too. And it mattered from very early on, in ways that we are still learning to appreciate. Debate about the details will continue. That is healthy. Every discipline benefits from the friction of disagreement, and ancient DNA and paleoanthropology are no exceptions. New evidence will emerge, and some current interpretations will be revised. But the general direction of the field is clear. The picture of the deep past that ancient DNA is painting is one in which our ancestors were more capable, more knowledgeable, and more caring than we long imagined. That picture is not sentimental. It is grounded in evidence, and it is one of the most important gifts that ancient DNA has given us so far, because it recovers a version of the past in which our ancestors were not merely surviving, but actively trying to make survival possible for one another. Chapter 10. The Living Inheritance and the Answer to the Question. We have followed a long trail through this documentary. It has led us from a Neanderthal cave in the Zagros Mountains to a laboratory sequencing plaque from teeth that stopped chewing 49,000 years ago. It has led us from broken bones that healed against the odds to the grandmothers who may have carried the knowledge that made the healing possible. It has led us through the interbreeding of species, the arrival of plague, the transitions of the Neolithic, and the debates that continue to shape our understanding. It is time now to answer, as directly as the evidence allows, the question this documentary asked at the beginning. What does ancient DNA reveal about the first healers? It reveals that the first healers existed. That is the first and most important thing. Before ancient DNA, we could speculate about prehistoric medicine, but we could not point to a specific individual and say, this person consumed this substance for this reason at this moment in the past. Now we can, and when we point, we find not a single case but a pattern. The pattern extends across species, across continents, and across 100,000 years or more. It is a pattern of care, of knowledge, and of practice. And it is a pattern that ancient DNA has finally made visible. It reveals that the first healers were not confined to our own species. Neanderthals were healers. Denisovans, whose behavioral record is smaller but whose genetic contributions are real, appear to have been part of the same broader tradition of care. Archaic African populations, whose genomes are still being reconstructed, contributed to the same story. The origins of medicine reach back before Homo sapiens emerged, and they involve populations that we would recognize as human in their compassion and their competence, even if their bodies and brains were shaped differently from ours. The circle of the first healers is wider than any of us imagined 30 years ago, and it continues to widen with every new sample analyzed. It reveals that the first healers drew on plants, on animals, and on techniques whose signatures we can now detect in physical evidence. Poplar for pain, penicillium for infection, yarrow, chamomile, and other plants whose residues appear repeatedly in ancient teeth. Trepanation for cranial pressure, splinting and stabilization for fractures, cauterization, likely, for wounds. Herbal preparations for a wide range of conditions, some of them documented in later written traditions, and some of them lost. The pharmacy of the first healers was, in effect, the landscape itself, read carefully and remembered accurately by generations of practitioners who learned each plant by touch and taste and smell before they learned it by name. It reveals that the first healers worked within communities. No individual healer in the deep past could have accomplished much alone. Care of the sick and injured requires labor from many people. It requires food gathered by others while the healer works. It requires shelter maintained by others while the patient recovers. It requires protection from predators and rivals while the vulnerable person heals. The first healers, therefore, were embedded in social networks of remarkable durability. Those networks, more than any individual skill, made prehistoric healing possible. The single healer, bent over the patient, is a modern image. The prehistoric image is a community bent around a patient, each member contributing what they could. It reveals that the first healers passed on their knowledge. The patterns we see in dental calculus, in healed injuries, in burial practices, and in genetic adaptation are not the patterns of one person or one generation. They are the patterns of continuous transmission across many generations. Grandmothers taught daughters. Daughters taught granddaughters. Elders taught the young of whatever gender was learning. Communities preserved what worked and discarded what did not. Over tens of thousands of years, this transmission built up bodies of practical wisdom that were sufficient to keep populations alive in landscapes that would have killed unaided individuals in days. The classroom was the campfire, the meadow, the deathbed. The curriculum was every plant and every wound the community had ever encountered. It reveals that the first healers responded to changing challenges. When the environment changed, they adapted. When new diseases emerged with agriculture, they searched for new remedies. When populations mixed, they exchanged knowledge. When settlements grew, some healers became specialists, while others continued the older, more distributed traditions. The story of medicine, from this angle, is not a single line of development. It is a tree, with many branches, many innovations, and many losses. And each branch tells us something about the specific conditions its practitioners faced, and the specific solutions they found. It reveals, perhaps most surprisingly, that the first healers still live inside us, not as ghosts, but as genes. The Neanderthal variants in our immune systems, the Denisovan variants that help some populations live at high altitude, the archaic African contributions that shape aspects of health and disease in modern African populations. These are not curiosities of ancient history. They are part of our present biology. When our immune systems respond to a virus, they respond, in part, with molecular machinery inherited from populations who died tens of thousands of years ago. When we take an aspirin for a headache, we activate a pathway first exploited by people whose species is no longer here. The past is not gone, it is inside us, working every day. And it reveals, finally, that the first healers were part of what made us human. Not the only thing, but part. Somewhere very deep in our lineage, we became a species that cared for those who could not care for themselves. That behavior may have started as parental care of infants, which is nearly universal among mammals. It extended, in our ancestors, to care of siblings, of injured group members, of the elderly, of the sick. It became a habit, then a practice, then a knowledge system, then a set of traditions. It has been with us so long that we hardly notice it, but it is one of the traits that most distinguishes us from most other species. And ancient DNA has now shown that it is much older than we thought, older than agriculture, older than language as we know it, older even than our species. There is a temptation, at this point in a documentary, to draw grand lessons for the present, to say that we should honor the wisdom of our ancestors, or that we should reconnect with nature, or that modern medicine has forgotten something important. Those lessons may be true, in their own ways, but they are not what this documentary is finally about. This documentary is about what ancient DNA has taught us, and what it has taught us is more modest than any grand lesson, and also more profound. It has taught us that human beings, and their closest relatives, have been trying to heal one another for a very long time. Longer than we knew, longer than our species has existed, longer than most of what we call culture. That trying has not always succeeded. Many patients died, many diseases outmatched the healers, many bodies of knowledge were lost when the communities that carried them collapsed. The record we are recovering now is not the record of a triumphant march. It is the record of an ongoing effort, punctuated by loss and by learning, and it is remarkable precisely because it has never stopped. But the effort has been continuous. That is the striking fact. Across ice ages and warm periods, across the emergence and extinction of related species, across the transitions of agriculture and civilization, human beings have never, so far as ancient DNA can tell, stopped trying to help one another survive. The tools have changed, the plants have changed, the diseases have changed, the names have changed. But the practice at its core has been the same. Someone gets hurt, someone else notices, something is done, and, sometimes, it works. That simple sequence, repeated across 100,000 years, is the deepest history of medicine that we possess. The next time you sit in a doctor's office, or hold the hand of a sick relative, or reach for a bottle of aspirin, remember that you are participating in a chain that stretches back through every stage of human history and into the deep past before history began. That chain does not begin with the first medical school. It does not begin with the first hospital. It does not begin with the first written prescription. It begins somewhere in the mountains of Iraq, or the caves of Spain, or the plains of Siberia, or the valleys of Eastern Africa, at a moment we cannot precisely date. It begins when one of our ancestors, human or not quite human, looked at another suffering ancestor and decided to help. That moment was the beginning of medicine. Everything since then has been elaboration. Ancient DNA has finally shown us, in the traces of plants in ancient teeth and the shapes of healed ancient bones, that the moment was real. It happened. It kept happening. And it is still happening, every day, in every place where people care for people. The first healers are not entirely gone. Their inheritance is our inheritance, and the knowledge they carried, passed down through many generations, many species, many landscapes, is part of the reason we are alive to remember them at all. Conclusion. We began this documentary in a cave in northern Iraq, with a man whose right arm had failed him long before his heart finally stopped. We asked how such a man could have lived so long, given what his body had been through. We asked who had kept him alive, and we asked what it would take, in evidence, to answer questions like that with something more than romantic speculation, with something firmer than the imagination of a sympathetic archaeologist standing over ancient bones. The answer, we have seen, has come from a technology that would have been unimaginable when Shanidar was first excavated. Ancient DNA has given us a window into the bodies and the mouths, and the diseases and the diets of prehistoric people. And through that window we have glimpsed something remarkable. We have glimpsed the first healers. They were quieter than we might have hoped, and older than we might have expected, and more numerous than any single site can capture. They were not who we expected. They were not modern humans in white robes gathering wisdom in libraries. They were Neanderthals in caves chewing bark. They were Denisovans on high plateaus, whose genes still help some of us breathe thin air. They were archaic Africans whose bloodlines merged with ours and gave us tools for surviving diseases we had never seen. They were grandmothers whose long lives, unusual in the mammal world, gave them time to learn and time to teach. They were farmers who watched their villages die of plague and tried, with the tools they had, to save the next generation. They were, together, a network of care that reached across time and species and geography, and that has never, in all the history we can reconstruct, come to an end. The evidence for this comes from many sources, but the most striking is the molecular evidence. When we read the plaque on a Neanderthal tooth, we read her attempt to survive. When we read the strain of Yersinia pestis in a Neolithic girl, we read the disease that killed her community. When we read the immune variants in our own genomes, we read the exchanges that let some populations survive when others did not. Each of these readings is a small window. Together, they build a picture that is bigger than any of them, and richer than any single line of evidence could produce alone. The picture is not perfect. It has gaps. It has debates. It has interpretations that will be revised as more evidence emerges. That is as it should be. Real science is not a set of frozen conclusions. It is a continuing conversation. And in the case of the first healers, the conversation is only about 20 years old, dating from the maturation of ancient DNA techniques and the discovery of dental calculus as an archaeological archive. What we know now is small compared to what we may know in 50 years, but what we know is already enough to change how we think about medicine, about human evolution, and about what our ancestors were capable of. They were capable of care. They were capable of knowledge. They were capable of teaching. They were capable of trying and failing and trying again. They were capable of building traditions that outlasted individual lives, of exchanging wisdom across species boundaries, and of responding to new challenges with old tools when necessary and new tools when possible. They were, in every meaningful sense, the ancestors of modern medicine, and modern medicine is their inheritor, whether it always remembers or not. There is one image, more than any other, that stays with me as this documentary closes. It is not the image of a specific bone, though many bones have earned that place. It is the image of a young Neanderthal woman in a cave in northern Spain, 49,000 years ago, chewing a piece of poplar bark and pressing it against the throbbing tooth in the back of her jaw. She does not know, and cannot know, that we will one day read what she did. She does not know that her teeth will become evidence, or that her small act of self-care will become a footnote in the history of pharmacy. She only knows that her tooth hurts, and that the bark helps. She does what she has been taught. She survives, for a while, then she dies. And her tooth, in dying, becomes a message across the widest gap of time our species has yet learned to cross. The message is this: we have always tried. Long before we knew what we were doing, long before we had words for what was happening in our bodies, long before we had the science to explain why one plant worked and another did not, we tried. We tried to save the ones we loved. We tried to save ourselves. Sometimes we succeeded. Often we failed. But we did not stop, and we have not stopped since. Ancient DNA has become our translator. It has read the message the woman left, and it has read the messages of many others like her, buried in the teeth and bones of the deep past. What it has told us is not that the past was better than the present. It is not that. What it has told us is that the present grew out of the past, and that the roots of what we do today reach far deeper than we ever imagined. The healer at the bedside of a modern patient is standing at the end of a very long line. The line stretches back through medical schools and monasteries, through Roman battlefields and Egyptian temples, through Neolithic villages and Paleolithic camps, through caves and shelters and open plains, into the darkness where our species began, and even into the darkness before our species began. At the beginning of the line, we do not find nothing. We do not find silence. We find, instead, a person leaning over another person and doing what she has been taught. That is the first healer. That is who ancient DNA has, at last, allowed us to see. And in seeing her, we see ourselves, because the impulse that guided her hand is the same impulse that guides ours, and it has been alive in our lineage for longer than any of us knew.